It's good news that he feels we will be able to withdraw some troops. To change the strategy from the surge would be a terrific mistake. John McCain, U.S. Senator, Presidential Candidate 2008.
Welcome back to Inside Iraq. With me are Edward Walker, Robert Gard, Patrick Clausen, and Steve Clemens. Mr. Walker, how much of what happened this entire week was for U.S. domestic consumption rather than really a fair assessment of the situation in Iraq and how to look forward?
Well, actually, I think it was a relatively fair assessment if you look at what was said and don't pay too much attention to what was not said, because it's some of the things that were not said that have caused the problems. I think that it was very much designed for the American people. It was designed to give the president the running room to run this policy out through the summer and then on into the end of his administration. And I think he's been successful in that. It was also a guarded message to the Iranians and to Al-Qaeda, but not as aggressive as he has been in the past. So there was a nuance there. Particularly when you look at Crocker's testimony about the talks with the Iranians, he clearly has not given up on them.
Steve Clemens, well, when you say that what has not been said, we shouldn't focus on it, but isn't what have not been said really the most crucial of the entire situation in Iraq, which is what is the Maliki government doing at this stage?
Well, I think that is one of the key questions. And, you know, one of the major news networks here, CNN, did a profile of the president's primetime speeches and the way in which the president's own narrative had changed dramatically. And I think that whether it's the questions about benchmarks, but really the political reconciliation, and I think Patrick Clausen is exactly right on the money in focusing on what Ryan Crocker put on the table, is that there's been an complete absence of progress in the very important area of political deal-making in that region. But your first question about was this designed for an American audience? Absolutely, because the president's got to try to square with the American people and try to re-rationalize why we're there and why American men and women are dying and why this is all worth it. I think the president largely succeeded. And I think he succeeded because, in part, the Democrats don't really want to win. They want the president to bear the burden and responsibility for this war until the election. That may be a mistake, but that's what is, in fact, taking place. And you know, I also think that what's very interesting is embedded in the president's speech was a embedded critique of anyone who challenged his view of what was happening as those who would leave Iraq to either Al-Qaeda or to Iran. And I think it was a very, very powerful message.
But Patrick Clausen, the biggest critique of this report were actually the Iraqi people. A recent poll said that 70% of the Iraqis think that the surge is not working, and actually the security in their own area has deteriorated over the past 6 months.
That's true, and it is an indication of just how much Iraqis are dissatisfied with the current situation. Iraqis have, on the whole, decided that the Americans aren't being very effective at providing security. However, the good side is that of this development is that it appears that many Iraqis have therefore decided that they have to provide their own security, and they have to be prepared to work with the Americans in doing that. So what we are seeing is, both in the Sunni and the Shia community, increasing willingness to work with the Americans to provide by Iraqis, and the Iraqis themselves providing the security in their local areas, and recognizing that the Americans aren't going to do it for them, that the Americans are only going to be a small contributing factor in that security situation, which the Iraqis themselves have to take principal responsibility for.
But Robert Gard, now what we have is that Sunnis are cooperating with the Americans, Shias are cooperating with the Americans, they are not cooperating with each other. Aren't they actually preparing the after-Americans period, what happens, arming themselves and preparing themselves to what happens after the American troops pull out?
Well, I think that is a matter of deep concern. Counterinsurgency strategy and tactics isn't really very well suited to deal with civic violence and a civil war. And I think the Shia are quite suspicious of our arming some of the tribes in Anbar and elsewhere. And I don't see a diminution in the hostility between those two groups, at least not in the near term.
So, Steve Clemens, I see you nodding there in agreement.
Well, I basically think that what is happening and evolving there, and I think it's a big debate, is if the United States were not there and we were not, I'm not sure how much a buffer we are, but if you consider us some sort of a buffer, we create kind of a moral hazard problem, if you will, in the region. And the view is that if we were to withdraw tomorrow, that you would have a vicious, escalating civil war, and that our buffer status is somehow preempting some of that. Now, the alternative is that our removing ourselves may, in fact, lead tribal leaders to stare into the abyss, see how horrific the situation will be, and to become mature and try and stabilize the situation among themselves. I really don't know which of those are the right scenario. I think that's the kind of debate we need to be having. But I agree with the general that the worry about a no diminution right now being in sight regarding the Shia and Sunni competition, or Shia and Shia competition, for resources and power and status and whatever evolves in the future of Iraq is probably right and probably the dominant fear among observers here in Washington.
Mr. Walker, isn't the biggest problem for President Bush really this current government in Iraq? It is the government who is not willing to help other provinces. It's the government who is not willing to bring about national reconciliation. So no matter what he does, he doesn't have the backing back in Baghdad.
Well, I don't think the people in Baghdad have the ability to do what we would like them to do. I don't see how they can mend the breaches that exist between the various sectors of the country because they simply don't have the political power. What we're seeing is a move away from the central government, even by our own administration, arming effectively militias, sectarian militias in the region, sectarian police units, walking away from the national institutions, and all in the name of adding to the security, and for a while it'll work. The question is what happens when you start walking away. The other problem is, something that we haven't talked about, is the role that Iran might play if we did walk out of the Iraqi situation. Most clearly, they have every intention of filling any vacuum, particularly in the south. That's going to create enormous pressures on the Saudis and others. We could see our position in the whole region evaporate. We don't really want to see that.
It's a catch-22 situation with Iran. I mean, the more you stay, the more the U.S. stays, the more they will get involved. And if the U.S. leaves, they will also get involved. How can you solve that one?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, but the fact is that what we have to do is we have to reassure other countries in the region, particularly in the Gulf states, the Saudis and the other smaller Gulf states, that we're not going to walk away from their security and their situation, and that we're not going to become an ally of one side or another side in the sectarian battle that takes place. The worst thing can happen to us is we become identified either with Sunnis or Shiites. That's a very huge risk in this proposition. I think the administration has to straddle that line.
So Patrick Closen, if you can't be identified with either Sunnis or Shias, then the U.S. is in the middle acting as a buffer zone. How long can it do that for?
Well, the United States can encourage both communities to accept the principle that they're going to have power in their own areas.
But hasn't it been doing that for the past 3 years? Hasn't it been trying to do that for the past 3 years?
No. For the past 3 years, what we've concentrated on is saying that they have to reach an agreement about how to run the national government. And what we have changed in the last 6 months is to an approach of now saying, live and let live. You take control in your areas and let the other people have control in their areas. That's a very different approach than saying that you all have to agree to work together very closely on running a central government in Baghdad. Now the focus is on live and let live. Have the Sunnis have power in Anbar, and let the Shia have powers in Basra and Najaf and Karbala, and the two sides respect the other right to live where they are.
But wouldn't that lead to the partition of Iraq? But wouldn't that lead to the partition of Iraq? Make it quicker?
No more than the situation in Belgium, where you have two regions which each respect the right of the other to run things, and then there's a weak federal government. There are many situations around the world. Look at the United Arab Emirates. You have 7 emirates, each of which is quite powerful, and a weak central government. That's the model which it seems that will probably work best in Iraq, and which Iraqis look like they're beginning to accept.
Now, my last question is, how much of this week, to what extent will this week affect the presidential elections?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that the staging of this week has major impact, because I think the president has prevented many, particularly in the Senate side, many Republicans from further defecting from his position, and that's very, very important. There are 21 Republican seats up in 2008 versus 12 Democratic, and the view was that all of those Republican senators were going to have to square with their voters over the problems of the Iraq War. I think that's major. I think the Democratic side, however, is also telling, because these Democrats are trying to differentiate themselves from each other in a very crowded marketplace of competition right now. They're all resisting homogenizing their message, and I think the president is using that to his advantage quite well. So I think we're going to get, as much as I disagree with the president's policy, which is largely a status quo incrementalism, and we're not going to see any big breakthroughs, I think the president is winning.
Gentlemen, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much. Edward Walker, Robert Gard, Patrick Closen, and Steve Clemens. When we come back, we'll take a look at the implications of the Petraeus report for Iraq and the Middle East.